The morning started like any other one in that office. The copy machine was jamming again. Somebody had burned popcorn in the break room. I was standing by my desk with a paper cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm when my phone buzzed. It was the hospital in Dayton. By the time I walked down the hall to Linda's office, I was still trying to understand the words I'd just heard. My father had died that morning. Sudden heart failure. No warning. No long decline. Just one call. And then the day was split into before and after. Linda was at her desk when I stepped in. She had one hand on her keyboard and the other wrapped around a highlighter. She didn't look up right away. The office light above her made everything look a little washed out, even her face. I said, "I need a few days off. My dad passed this morning." That got her eyes on me for about half a second. "The service is in Kentucky," I said. "I need 4 days, maybe 5 with the drive." She leaned back a little, like she was reviewing a request for printer toner. "You can have 2. I thought I might have heard her wrong. I just stood there for a second with the coffee cooling in my hand. "It's almost 9 hours each way," I said. "I'm his only son." She gave a small shrug. "You can attend remotely if you need to." There are moments when a person says something so cold, so practical, that your mind goes quiet before it reacts. That was one of them. I looked at her, then at the framed mission statement on the wall behind her, then back at her again. "This is my father," I said. She let out a breath through her nose, already impatient. "We're in the middle of the Belmore conversion. Everybody is expected to be here. I'm sorry for your loss, but this is still a business." I remember how still I got after that. Not calm exactly, just still. I had worked for that company almost 4 years. I built half the internal process notes they used. I stayed late without being asked. Covered for people who forgot meetings, missed deadlines, lost passwords, broke things they didn't understand. I had never once asked for special treatment. And there I was, standing in a narrow office that smelled faintly like toner and lemon cleaner, being told I could watch my father's funeral on a screen. I said, "All right." That seemed to satisfy her. She turned back to her monitor as if the conversation had already ended. I walked out without another word. What I remember most from that hallway was the sound. Not people talking, not phones, just the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the low air conditioning vent above the ceiling tiles. My cubicle was halfway down on the left, same as always. Gray fabric walls, one dying plant, a calendar I hadn't turned in 2 months. I never made it to my desk. I kept walking, past accounting, past the supply closet, past the faded poster about teamwork curling at the corners, then through the front doors and out into the parking lot where the heat was already rising off the pavement. I sat in my car for a long time with both hands on the steering wheel. I didn't cry then. That came later. What I felt first was something cleaner than anger, something quieter, a line being drawn. Before I started the engine, I noticed an unread message on my phone from an unknown number. I didn't open it. Not yet. I just turned the screen face down and drove home. My apartment was dark when I got there. I dropped my bag by the couch, took off my shoes, and stood in the kitchen without turning on the overhead light. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a motorcycle passed and faded. On the stove, the clock glowed 10:58. My father had lived outside Lexington for most of my life. Small brick house, detached garage, coffee always too strong. He raised me alone after I was 10, and he did it the same way he did everything else, quietly, directly, without asking for much. He could fix almost anything with enough time and a clean workbench. I kept thinking about his hands, the nicks across his knuckles, the sawdust that never seemed to wash completely out of the lines in his skin, the way he would nod once when something was settled. I lay down on the bed still wearing my work shirt and stared at the ceiling. Around midnight, my phone lit up again. Then again, work messages this time. A missed call from Linda, one from Darren, my department head. Then an email asking whether I would be available first thing in the morning for Belmore status review. Nobody asked how I was holding up. Nobody asked what I needed. I rolled onto my side and looked at the edge of my laptop bag sitting against the dresser. That was when I remembered something I had not thought about in months. A folder, then another one, a set of notes, guides, scripts, and reference files I had built over time because nobody else had bothered to document the systems we depended on. Not company records, not client data, just the pieces I made with my own hands to keep the place from falling over every other week. I got up, walked to the dresser, and set the laptop on the bed. Then I waited. I sat there for a while before I opened the laptop. The room was quiet except for the refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the occasional car passing outside. The screen light filled the bedroom with that pale blue glow everyone recognizes after midnight. I logged in the same way I had hundreds of times before. Remote connection, company credentials, two-factor prompt. The system opened without hesitation. It always did. I leaned back against the headboard and let the screen settle in front of me. My father's house came to mind again. The smell of wood stain in the garage. The metal coffee can he kept loose screws in. I remembered him saying once, almost casually, if you build something, build it so it doesn't collapse the moment someone else touches it. I had tried to do that at work. Most people in the office didn't know how much of the system actually depended on quiet patches and small fixes. The official documentation was thin. The Real instructions lived in scattered emails, half-remembered conversations, and the notes people kept for themselves. Over time, I had started keeping my own records. Nothing dramatic, just practical things. Integration checklists, troubleshooting steps, API call structures that weren't explained anywhere else. A few scripts that fixed problems the official tools never addressed. Most of it I wrote at night after everyone else had logged off. Not because anyone asked me to, mostly because it made the next day easier. I opened the first folder. There were dozens of files inside. Plain text notes, diagrams, configuration backups, scripts I had refined over the years. Things that explained why certain systems behaved the way they did, and how to repair them when they inevitably broke. Anyone else opening the system without that knowledge would spend days guessing. I sat there quietly and read through a few of the files. Outside, a dog barked once and then stopped. The apartment felt still in that late-night way where time stretches out a little wider. Another message popped onto my screen. Linda, we need confirmation you'll be online tomorrow. Belmore Migration Review at 8:30. No question about the funeral. No mention of my father. Just the migration. I closed the message window and went back to the folders. That was when something simple occurred to me. Not revenge. Nothing like that. My father would have hated that kind of thinking. But clarity. For 4 years I had quietly built systems that kept their projects running smoothly. I had written explanations no one bothered to read. I had solved problems before they became emergencies. And none of that had mattered until the moment I needed something small in return. For days. That was the number I kept coming back to. For days. I rested my hands on the keyboard and thought about the situation the way my father used to approach a repair job. Not emotionally, just step by step. First, understand what actually belongs where. Second, remove anything that doesn't. Third, leave the system honest. I started by reviewing the shared company directories. The folders looked the same as they always did. A mix of official project documents and small pieces of knowledge people had uploaded over time. Some were useful, many weren't. Buried inside were several files that I recognized immediately. My files, not client records, not proprietary code, just the guides and internal notes I had written to help people navigate the mess. They had slowly migrated into shared folders because co-workers asked for copies. I never paid much attention to it. Until that moment, I created a new folder on my desktop. Then I began moving things. Carefully, methodically, every guide I had written myself. Every troubleshooting document built from my own notes. Every script that existed only because I stayed late one night and figured something out. I copied them first, then checked them, then copied them again. It took hours. The clock on the taskbar rolled past 2 in the morning, then 3. The apartment grew cooler as the night settled in. I didn't rush. Every file I touched had a small story behind it. A problem solved. A system stabilized. A process that worked only because someone had quietly made it work. At around 5:30 in the morning, the folder on my desktop was complete. Everything that belonged to me was now in one place. I leaned back and rubbed my eyes. Then I looked at the shared directories again. A few of the folders still contained references to documents that no longer existed. That would cause confusion later. So I opened a plain text file and typed a single sentence. Documentation removed by original author. No anger. No explanation. Just a statement of fact. When I finished, I saved the file and placed it where the documents had been. The system looked different now. Cleaner, in a way. I closed the remote connection and shut the laptop. The sky outside my window had started turning gray. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. 3 missed calls. All from work. I didn't check the voicemail. Instead, I stood up, packed a small bag, and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. The apartment smelled faintly like dust and coffee grounds. On the counter sat my car keys and a folded airline itinerary I had booked an hour earlier. A one-way ticket to Louisville. Boarding time, 8:40 a.m. I picked up the keys and slipped them into my pocket. Then I waited. By the time the sun came up, I was already on the road to the airport. The traffic was light that morning. Commuters just starting to fill the highway, headlights still on in the early gray light. I kept the radio off and drove in silence. My phone buzzed a few times in the cup holder. I didn't look at it. At the airport, I parked in the economy lot, slung my backpack over one shoulder, and walked inside. The terminal smelled like coffee and floor cleaner. A few travelers were lined up at security, most of them quiet and half awake. For the first time since the hospital call, my mind felt settled. There was nothing left for me to decide. I boarded the flight, found my seat near the middle of the plane, and rested my head back as the engines started their low, steady whine. The woman beside me opened a magazine. Across the aisle, someone was already asleep. When we lifted off, the city shrank beneath the window. My phone was still off. I didn't turn it back on until we landed in Louisville a little after 2 in the afternoon. The screen lit up immediately. Missed calls stacked across the display. Linda, Darren, a few numbers from coworkers, and a handful of emails. I opened the first voicemail while walking through the terminal. Darren's voice came through, tense but controlled. Fame-like, we're having trouble locating some documentation tied to the Belmore migration. If you could call me back as soon as possible, we'd appreciate it. The second voicemail was Linda. Her tone had changed. We're seeing several missing files in the shared directories. If this was accidental, please contact us immediately so we can restore access. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and kept walking. Outside the terminal, the air felt warmer than home. The rental shuttle idled near the curb, doors open, driver leaning against the side talking to someone with a suitcase. I climbed aboard and sat near the back. No anger, no excitement, just quiet. By the time I picked up the rental car and started the drive toward Lexington, my phone had gathered another set of messages. This time they were emails. One from Darren. We need clarification regarding the removal of internal documentation. Another from Linda. These materials are considered company work product. Please respond immediately. I read both messages once. Then I put the phone face down on the passenger seat and kept driving. The road south of Louisville gradually opened into long stretches of farmland. Fences, low barns, fields just beginning to turn green again. My father had lived outside Lexington for almost 20 years. Same brick house the entire time. When I turned onto his road, the familiar quiet settled in. The porch light was still on when I pulled into the driveway. I sat in the car for a moment before getting out. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. Small porch, 2 chairs by the railing, wind chime hanging near the corner that gave a soft hollow sound when the breeze caught it. Inside, the air carried the smell I remembered from childhood. Coffee, sawdust, old books. His boots were still by the door. I stepped into the kitchen and set my bag on the chair. A half-empty mug sat on the counter beside the sink. The surface of the coffee inside had gone dull and still. It felt like he had just stepped out for a minute. I stood there quietly for a long time. That evening, I went out to the garage. The heater in the corner made a soft ticking sound as it warmed up. Tools hung neatly on the wall above the workbench, each one in the place he always kept it. I pulled the stool up and sat down. For a while, I just looked around. Eventually, my phone vibrated again. I checked the screen. An email from Linda marked urgent. Client reporting issues related to Belmore migration. Please advise immediately. Another from Darren followed a few minutes later. We need to discuss the missing documentation and next steps. I read both messages slowly. Then I opened a reply window. Not to them, to Darren only. My response was short. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern works for a call. I'll send the invite. I didn't add anything else. No explanation. No apology. Just a time. I scheduled the meeting and set the calendar invitation to go out automatically. 2 p.m., right in the middle of their migration deadline window. Then I closed the laptop and leaned back in my father's chair. The garage was quiet except for the low hum of the heater. I rested my hands on the edge of the workbench and looked at the tools hanging along the wall. For the first time since leaving the office hallway, I felt something close to calm. Then I waited. The next morning started slowly. I woke up on the old couch in the living room just after sunrise. Light was coming through the thin curtains, soft and pale, the same way it always had when I visited as a kid. The house was quiet except for the creak of the floorboards when the heat kicked on. For a moment I forgot where I was. Then I remembered. I made coffee the way my father did, 2 scoops more than the instructions suggested. The kitchen filled with that strong, bitter smell that used to drift down the hallway when I was getting ready for school. I poured a cup into his old chipped mug and carried it to the table. My laptop was already there. The meeting was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. That gave me time to think clearly about what the conversation needed to be. Not emotional, not defensive, just structured. I opened the laptop and reviewed the calendar invitation. Darren had accepted within minutes the night before. Linda accepted shortly after that. A third name appeared on the list sometime during the night, someone from the company's legal department. That made sense. I took a slow sip of coffee and looked out the window toward the backyard. When my father faced a difficult situation, he always broke it down the same way. Not into feelings, into steps. So I did the same. Step 1, establish ownership. The files I removed were personal documentation I created independently. They did not contain client data or internal proprietary code. Step 2, establish the current reality. Without those documents, the migration project they were running would move significantly slower, possibly stall. Step 3, decide how much time I was willing to give them. I opened a blank document and began outlining a few notes. Nothing complicated, just the systems they were struggling with and the parts that tended to break when someone unfamiliar tried to adjust them. I wasn't writing a full manual, just reminders for myself so the conversation stayed efficient. Outside, the wind chime on the porch rang softly. Around 11 that morning my phone vibrated again. Another email. This one was from Linda. We expect full restoration of the removed documentation. Legal is reviewing the matter. Please confirm your intent before our call. I read the message twice. Then I closed it without replying. The point of the meeting wasn't to argue through email. At 1:45 p.m., I moved from the kitchen table to the small desk in the corner of the living room. The same desk my father used for paying bills and balancing his checkbook. I opened the meeting link early and waited. The room was quiet enough that I could hear a truck passing down the road outside. At exactly 2 p.m., the first window appeared on the screen. Darren. He looked tired. His collar was slightly crooked, and the office behind him was busier than usual. People moving past the glass walls, phones ringing somewhere off camera. A second window opened. Linda. Her posture was the same as always, straight back, tight expression, hands folded in front of her keyboard. The third window joined a few seconds later. A woman I didn't recognize. Dark glasses, legal pad, very still posture. No one spoke for a moment. Then Darren cleared his throat. Mike, he said carefully. First, we're sorry about your father. I nodded once. He continued. We also need to address the documentation removed from our shared systems. Several operational processes depend on those files. Linda leaned forward slightly. You created those materials during your employment here, she said. They're considered company work product. Her tone was controlled. Professional. I rested my hands on the desk. The files I removed were reference materials I wrote personally, I said. They don't contain client data, internal code, or confidential records. The legal representative finally spoke. Regardless of content, materials created during company time may still be considered proprietary. I nodded once. That may be something your legal team wants to review, I said. But the practical issue is simpler. Darren looked at me closely. The migration project, I continued, depends on knowledge that wasn't formally documented by the company. I wrote those guides so the systems would stay operational. Linda's expression tightened. We need them restored. I shook my head once. I won't be restoring them. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. No one raised their voice. Darren rubbed his forehead slowly. Then help us understand the path forward, he said. That was the moment where the conversation shifted. From emotion to structure. I folded my hands together. There's a straightforward option, I said. Linda's eyes narrowed slightly. What option? I spoke calmly. I'm not returning to the company as an employee, but I'm willing to provide consulting support. I can walk your team through the systems, answer questions, and help stabilize the migration. Darren leaned closer to his screen. Under what terms? I had already written the number down earlier that morning. $300 an hour, I said. 20-hour minimum. Payment up front. Linda's reaction was immediate. That's unreasonable. I didn't argue. It reflects the current situation. The legal representative stayed quiet, writing something on her pad. Darren looked between the two of them. And availability? He asked. I'm handling my father's estate this week, I said. So my time is limited. 2 hours per day at most. Linda stared at the screen like she was trying to decide whether to challenge it again. But Darren had already shifted into problem-solving mode. Send us the terms, he said finally. We'll review them. I nodded once. When the payment clears, we can schedule the first session. The legal representative spoke again before the call ended. Please confirm that no additional company material has been deleted. I answered simply. Everything that belonged to me has already been removed. No anger, just clarity. A few seconds later, I ended the call. The living room fell quiet again. I closed the laptop, set it on the desk, and walked back into the kitchen. Then I waited. Thursday morning came with a thin layer of frost on the grass behind the house. I woke before the alarm and stood for a moment in the kitchen, watching the light move slowly across the backyard. The maple tree near the fence had lost most of its leaves already, and the wind pushed the last few across the ground in small circles. The funeral was scheduled for 10. I dressed quietly. Black shirt, dark jacket, nothing formal. My father wouldn't have liked anything too polished. Before leaving, I checked my email. One new message had arrived overnight. It was from Darren. Attached was a short consulting agreement. The terms matched exactly what I had outlined a day before. At the bottom was a confirmation from their finance department. Payment had already been processed. I read the document once, closed the laptop, and left it on the kitchen table. The chapel in Lexington was small and familiar, the same one we had used when my mother passed years earlier. Wooden pews, tall windows with colored glass that turned the morning light soft and muted. People arrived slowly. Neighbors from down the road. A couple of my father's co-workers from the community college where he used to repair equipment. A man from the hardware store who shook my hand and said my father once spent 2 hours helping him fix a snowblower without charging $1. Everyone seemed to have a small story like that. I listened, nodded, thanked them. The service itself was simple. A few prayers. One my father liked. A short message from a pastor who knew him through local volunteer work. No long speeches. No dramatic moments. Just quiet respect. Afterward, people gathered outside near the gravel parking lot. The wind carried the smell of dry leaves and distant with smoke. Someone pressed a small plate of cookies into my hand. Someone else told me about a fence my father had helped repair last winter. Eventually, the crowd began to thin. I walked around the side of the building where the shed stood near the back of the property. It was a small wooden structure used to store tools and maintenance supplies. Inside, the air smelled like sawdust and cold metal. A workbench ran along the far wall, and sitting on that bench was something I hadn't expected to see. A small wooden pendant. Walnut, by the look of it. Rough around the edges, still unfinished. The hole for the cord hadn't even been drilled yet. I picked it up and turned it slowly in my hand. I remembered him mentioning it a month earlier. He had cut a piece of walnut from an old tree in my aunt's yard and said he might try carving something out of it. He never got around to finishing it. I found a piece of sandpaper in the drawer below the bench and sat down on the stool. For a while I just worked the edges lightly, smoothing the surface the way he would have done it. The steady motion helped quiet everything else in my mind. My phone vibrated once in my jacket pocket. Then again. When I finally checked it, there were 15 missed calls. All from work. I didn't listen to the messages. Instead, I drove back to the house and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The first consulting session was scheduled for 9 the next morning. Right on time, the video meeting window opened. This time the screen was full. Darren was there. Linda too. Several members of their technical team. A few unfamiliar faces who looked like outside consultants or project managers. Everyone seemed tired. Darren spoke first. We've run into multiple system failures since yesterday, he said. We'd appreciate your guidance walking through the key processes. I nodded once. Let's start with the reporting service. I shared my screen and began explaining the structure of the system. Not quickly, not slowly either, just clearly. Which server handled which task, where certain scripts triggered automatically, why one database connection tended to fail every third run unless a particular parameter was reset. Occasionally someone asked a question. I answered it. Occasionally someone suggested skipping ahead. I declined. You're paying for clarity, I said once. Clarity requires context. No one argued after that. About halfway through the session, I noticed something. Linda had stopped interrupting. Instead, she was taking notes. Darren asked a few technical questions near the end of the call, the kind he would have asked months earlier if anyone had ever explained how the system really worked. After an hour and 40 minutes, the meeting reached a natural stopping point. Darren leaned toward the camera. "That was extremely helpful," he said. "We'll likely need additional sessions next week to complete the migration." I shook my head gently. "That's not included in the agreement." Linda looked up immediately. "But the project, I'll be at my father's attorney's office next week," I said calmly. "Estate paperwork." The screen went quiet again. For a moment, it seemed like they were just now remembering how the situation started. Linda finally spoke, quieter than usual. "Then please let us know when you're available again." I nodded. "If there are written questions, send them by email." Darren thanked me again before ending the meeting. The moment the screen went dark, the kitchen felt very still. I closed the laptop and set my hands on the table. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, pushing leaves across the driveway. Then I waited. The next consulting session happened the following Tuesday. By then, the house had settled into a quiet routine. I would wake early, make coffee the way my father liked it, and spend a little time in the garage before opening the laptop. The place still smelled faintly of sawdust and machine oil. It felt steady in a way the office never had. That morning, I set the laptop on the kitchen table again and joined the call at exactly 9. The screen filled with the same faces as before, but the mood had changed. Darren looked worn down. His tie was loosened and his eyes carried that tired look people get after several nights without proper sleep. Linda sat rigid in her chair, arms folded on the desk. A few members of the technical team avoided eye contact with the camera. Darren spoke first. "The demonstration for Belmore didn't go well," he said. "The client delayed the rollout." I nodded slowly. "Understood." Linda leaned forward. "They're giving us 2 weeks to fix the system." There was no accusation in her voice this time, just pressure. We moved into the work, one question at a time, one problem at a time. They described what they were seeing on their end. Failed reports, broken queries, a set of automated jobs that kept pulling incorrect data for several departments. I walked them through the causes. Sometimes it was a missing step, sometimes a misconfigured setting, sometimes an issue that had existed for months but had never been fully addressed. I didn't rush the explanations. The whole point of the sessions was clarity. About halfway through, Darren asked if we could skip some of the background and move directly to the solution. I shook my head. "If you want the system stable," I said calmly, "you need to understand why the problems occur." No one pushed back. By the end of the session, they had a list of specific corrections to work through. Darren thanked me again. The team members nodded quietly. Just before the meeting ended, he hesitated. "There's one more thing," he said. Linda looked at him, then back toward the screen. Darren cleared his throat. "We've been discussing a possible long-term arrangement." I leaned back slightly in the chair. "What kind of arrangement?" Linda spoke next. "A leadership position, director level." The room on their end seemed to pause. "You would manage your own technical team," she continued. 3 engineers to start. Remote work if you prefer." Darren added, "There would also be a salary increase, roughly 50% above your previous compensation." I listened without interrupting. They were both watching me carefully now. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Finally, I folded my hands together. "You're making this offer because the system is struggling," I said. Darren shifted slightly in his chair. "We recognize the value of the work you've done." I shook my head once. "You had 4 years to recognize it." No one responded immediately. The silence wasn't hostile, just uncomfortable. I kept my tone even. When I asked for 4 days off to bury my father, the answer was 2. And the suggestion was to attend remotely. Linda looked down at her desk. Darren exhaled slowly. "We handled that poorly," he admitted. I nodded. Yes. There wasn't anything else to add. The offer sat there between us for a moment longer. Then Darren asked quietly, "Is there any version of the offer you would consider?" I thought about the house around me, the garage, the quiet road outside, the way the wind moved through the trees behind the property, the small walnut pendant still sitting on the workbench where I had been sanding it the day before. Then I answered. No. Linda looked up again. "Not because of the money," I continued, "or the title." I paused briefly, but because it required everything to fall apart before anyone noticed the work that was already being done. The call stayed silent. Darren nodded slowly. "I understand." I closed the meeting window a moment later. The laptop screen returned to the quiet reflection of the kitchen. For a while I just sat there. Then I shut the computer and stepped outside onto the porch. The afternoon air felt cooler now. A few dry leaves drifted across the yard as the wind moved through the trees. A week later, an email arrived from someone in their finance department. Short message. Belmore had pulled out of the contract. 2 other clients were reviewing their agreements. No anger. No blame. Just information. I read the message once and closed it. Then I put the phone face down and went back out to the garage. About a month after the funeral, the house finally started to feel less like a place frozen in time. I spent a lot of mornings in the garage. Nothing complicated, just small tasks. Cleaning tools, organizing drawers, wiping the dust from shelves that had probably been ignored for years. The heater in the corner would click on every now and then, filling the quiet space with that low, steady hum. It helped. Work came next, but slowly. A small firm in Columbus had reached out not long after everything happened. 10 people total. No large departments. No long chains of managers. Just a small team that handled system integrations for regional companies. The first video call with their CEO was simple. He didn't open with a project deadline or a list of responsibilities. He asked one question first. How are you holding up after losing your father? That was the entire beginning of the conversation. I remember leaning back in my chair when he said that. Not because it surprised me exactly, just because it felt normal. We talked for nearly an hour after that. About work, of course. Systems I'd built before. Projects they were planning. But also about the way small teams function when people trust each other. I accepted the position a few days later. The first few weeks were quiet. No chaos. No sudden emergencies. Just steady work and clear communication. If someone needed help, they asked directly. If something broke, we fixed it together. Every now and then I would drive back to my father's house on the weekend. The garage stayed the same. One afternoon, I finished sanding the walnut pendant I had found on his workbench. The surface came out smooth, darker than it looked at first. I drilled the small hole he never got around to and threaded a simple cord through it. Not perfect, but solid. 6 months passed before I heard from Darren again. The message came through LinkedIn late one evening while I was finishing some documentation for a new project. His note was short. He said he had spent some time thinking about everything that happened, that the company had made several leadership changes since then, that he understood now how badly the situation had been handled. At the end, he added one more sentence. Your father sounded like a remarkable man. I read the message twice. Then I typed a short reply. He was. Thank you for saying that. I didn't add anything else. No long conversation followed. No attempt to reopen the past. Just a small acknowledgement, and then quiet. Later that night, I set the walnut pendant on the desk beside my laptop. The grain of the wood caught the light from the lamp. It reminded me of the garage again. The steady way my father approached everything he built. Some problems in life don't need dramatic endings. Sometimes the cleanest solution is simply stepping away from a place that never understood the value of quiet work. These days my mornings start with coffee and a clear schedule. Systems get built properly the first time. People ask questions before things break. And every now and then someone reaches out asking for advice about a situation at their own workplace. A manager who won't listen. A project that depends on one person carrying too much weight. I usually tell them the same thing my father told me when I was young. Understand the system. Then decide where you actually belong inside it. Before you go, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Drop your city and the local time down in the comments so we can see how far this community reaches. If you enjoyed the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you might think. And when you're ready, 2 other stories people here have been watching a lot will appear on your screen next. You might find those interesting too.